Hey everybody, Jeremy here, and this is a review of the Iconntechs Ultra HD 4K action camera. You can purchase this camera on Amazon.com for about $110. This camera is hoping to be somewhat of a low-cost alternative to some of the more expensive action cameras out there. Specs-wise, it boasts a 12-megapixel sensor, which is capable of recording 4K resolution at 24 frames per second, 1080p resolution at 60 frames per second, and 720p resolution at 120 frames per second. Going to put a little asterisk next to that 4K resolution, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Now let's take a closer look at this camera. It has a rubberized grip all the way around it, and that's really just to prevent it from slipping out of your hands in rather slippery situations. It's also very minimalistic when it comes to buttons. You get a power button on the front of the camera. On the top, you get an OK selector button, and on the sides you have up and down buttons, which are mostly just used to navigate through the menus. On the other side of the camera, you're going to find three different ports. One is going to hold your micro SD card. You also have a port for HDMI, as well as micro USB. And you're also going to use that micro USB slot to charge the camera. Now, one of the things that I do like about this camera is the fact that it has a screen on the back of it. It's a small screen and it doesn't have very high resolution, but it serves its purpose in that it allows you to see exactly what you're going to shoot while you're shooting it, so you never have to second guess yourself. Navigating through the menus is pretty straightforward, but it could be a little confusing at first. You have to tap the power button in order to access the menu, and you have to be careful to not hold the power button because that's going to turn the camera off. But once you get there, you have a huge amount of options to choose from. You can choose the resolution of your video, the resolution of any still frames that you might want to take. You can change the point of view of the camera in that it can narrow the field of view from the original 170-degree angle. You can play around with the Wi-Fi. You can turn the gyroscope and stability on and off, and a host of other things. So as far as options go, this camera certainly does not skip in that department. This camera also comes with an impressive number of mounts that you can use in a variety of situations. I don't think most people are going to find a use for every mount in the box, but the ones that I personally find most useful are the ones that allow me to connect the camera to a tripod, the one that lets me use the camera as a dash cam in my car, and the one that lets me connect it to the handlebars of my bike. But maybe you'll find a use for all the other ones as well. You're also going to get an exchangeable back door for the waterproof housing, and that'll allow you to bring more sound into the camera so that you can use the onboard microphone a little bit better. If you don't use that backing, don't expect to use the microphone because since it's watertight, sound is not going to really get in there. If I could, I would exchange a few of those mounts for one skeleton housing for the camera. And the reason for that is you can't use any of the mounts unless you have it in the waterproof housing. There are two plastic clips on the bottom of the housing, and that's how it can connect to all the mounts that come in the box. Speaking of video quality, let's take a look at some clips. Now, this first clip was shot early in the morning, about a couple of hours after sunrise. And as you can see as I'm walking towards the sun, the camera is not doing a very good job at exposing the entire scene properly. The sky is very blown out, and the sky becomes a little bit blue the further you go away from the sun. But the problem is the entire scene suffers for it, not just the sky. Everything in this image, in my eyes, looks like it's a little bit too bright. It's a little bit overexposed. Once I moved the camera away from the sun and pointed it in the opposite direction, you can see we start to retain some more details in the sky and in the grass, but the whole thing of overexposure still remains. Those greens should be a bit darker and those blues should be a bit darker as well. Even in this clip, as I'm walking, the sun is sort of being blocked by the trees, but by then the damage had already been done. Everything still looks blown out, looks a little bit too bright, and there's also some pretty bad chromatic aberration through the leaves of all the trees. And this was the most disappointing part of this camera to me, was that not being able to retain detail when it is subjected to bright sunlight, especially since having a lot of sunlight is ideal for just about any camera. So I needed to find a way to fix that problem, and I think I came up with a solution. Fortunately, this camera does give you some control over the exposure settings. I'm going to keep it at ISO 100 because that's going to give us the least amount of grain. So what I decided to do instead was to lower the exposure compensation. I lowered it by a full stop, so it was going to read as -0.1. I tried to do -0.7, but for some reason that kept freezing the camera and I had to keep turning it off. So I decided to just stick with negative 0.1. And when I did that, I saw a pretty big jump in terms of the quality. So we can see in this clip here, we can still see the clouds in the sky, which are white, as well as the blue in the sky. And even when things get a little bit bright, like when we're going under an overpass, the camera quickly rebounds and we can still see all of that detail in the sky. And it also does a really good job of maintaining the accuracy of the colors from all the different cars and leaves all around it. And in case you're wondering, yes, all the clips that you see from the car were taken with the camera set upon the included dashboard accessory. It does a pretty good job considering the only thing keeping it on the dashboard is a strip of 3M tape. Even in this hot Georgia sun, with my car usually being in the sun most of the time, the tape has not weakened, so there's very little, if at all, any wobble in any of the video clips that you see here. Everything looks very smooth and I'm very happy about that. So if you were wanting to use this as a way to capture some footage as you're driving across the countryside or wherever you're going, this is going to be a safe bet for that. I also have to tip my hat to how well this camera handled low lighting situations. As I'm pulling into this parking garage, as many of us know, parking garages on the inside tend to not be very well lit, and this one was no exception. But even with the exposure compensation tuned down an entire stop, we can still see pretty clearly inside of this parking garage without any additional light, without even turning on the night mode. So that was a very, very nice surprise. And as nice as this camera is inside the car, you're probably going to want to use this outdoors as well. So in these clips, I have the camera mounted to my body using the GoPro body mount. So yes, GoPro accessories will work with the housing and thumb screws that come with this camera. So if you already have a GoPro, you're in luck. You don't have to worry about those accessories going to waste. Now, as I said earlier, everything that you see here is being shot with the exposure compensation tuned down an entire stop. And I was very impressed with what I was seeing here. I still think that the scene is a tad bit dark. I wish it was just a little bit brighter, but of course that's the result of the exposure compensation. I really would have liked to tune the exposure compensation down to negative 0.7. I think that would have been the optimal exposure compensation for this camera, but I could not do it. But if you are planning on putting any of this into editing software and tweaking with it a little bit, you can just raise it back up in post and you should get some pretty good results. But the colors that this camera produces look really nice, and the sharpness is quite nice too. I had the sharpness tuned to the normal setting and it's doing a pretty good job at that. Nothing here looks over sharpened or too unnatural, and the colors are nice and vibrant and they pop pretty well. I also had the image stabilization as well as the gyroscope turned on in these videos, and it's doing a pretty good job. Now keep in mind this is strapped to my body, so any rocking that you see is just the natural reaction to my legs moving forward and back over and over again. But as far as keeping everything from shaking, I think it did a pretty good job of that. Now, even though I'm pretty impressed with the way the 1080p 60 frames per second video quality turned out on this camera, the same can't be said for the 4K resolution. And that's simply because there is no 4K resolution. There are a couple of standards for 4K, and one of them is 3840 by 2160. That's the resolution that you'll tend to get when you use cameras such as the Galaxy S7 Edge that has the capability of shooting 4K videos. But when you look at the details for the 4K files that this camera puts out, you'll see that it's only 2880 by 2160, and that unfortunately is not 4K. Now, is it higher than 1080p? Yes. Is it a higher resolution than 1440p? Yes, but it doesn't quite get to that 4K standard. So all in all, it's really just an outright lie. So if you're looking to get this camera solely because you wanted something that could shoot 4K video, unfortunately, you're going to have to look elsewhere. Now, since this 4K camera isn't really recording in 4K, I wanted to try something else out. This camera says that it can record 120 frames per second at 720p. Now, the main reason why you will want to shoot at a frame rate that high is so that you can slow the action down in post-processing, so you can get a slow yet very smooth video playback. So I decided to do a little simple test in my kitchen using a pot and some water. So I just took the water, I turned it on, and then I put the pot underneath the water and I started recording. And as you can see, this is what it basically looks like. So now in my video editing software, which is Premiere Pro, I decided to slow this clip down to be approximately 15% slower than the original clip. And as you can see here, there's something weird going on. It's very stuttery. It's not very smooth at all. It's almost like it's dropping frames, and that was very strange to me. So I decided to compare it to the GoPro Hero 3 Black Edition, which can also shoot 120 frames per second, also at 720p. So I did that, and I brought it right back into Premiere Pro and slowed it down to be 15% of its original speed. And what I saw was drastically different. With the GoPro's 120 frames per second slowed down video, everything looks very smooth. It doesn't look like there's any missing frames, and it doesn't look very jittery or very stuttery. But with the Iconntechs 4K camera, we're getting just that. We're getting stuttering. We're getting this weird hesitation going on. So it makes me wonder whether or not this is actually recording 120 individual frames per second, or if it's maybe only shooting 60 frames per second and duplicating every single one of those frames so that in the end it can be 120, but they're not 120 unique frames. Can't really tell for sure, but there's definitely something weird going on. And I really don't understand the need for any kind of funny business, because this is actually a capable little camera. It looks great. The 1080p 60 frames per second footage is sharp, it's vibrant, it's very crisp, and the motion is quite smooth. The 4K resolution that you get, well, technically not that bad looking. I think it still falls short of what you can get at 1080p. And that's fine, because right now, in this year, in this day and age, 1080p is still a pretty good standard to strive for. We know that 4K is pretty much here, but there's a lot of people who do not have access to 4K capable monitors or 4K capable televisions. So we still got some time before everyone catches up and 4K becomes the norm, just like 1080p is now. So if you're looking for an action camera that can give you some really good footage while you're recording things that are action oriented, this is a safe bet. If it turns you off that some of the features have been exaggerated, well, then you may want to look elsewhere for a camera. But for what it is, all the different mounts that you get and the screen that's on the back, I think this is a pretty good camera, and I recommend it if you're looking for one. So thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, I'm Jeremy, and I'll talk to you later.